This book, it tells of a heresy tale, one of 60 you may have heard of space marines, are they good or bad? It's hard to tell, will we ever find out? Dan is here to explain, let's talk about Prospero Burns. All right, I'm going to do a proper introduction. Watch me go. Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Mira Manga's Grimdark Buddies is the name we've been calling it. I'm with one of my faves, one of everybody's favorites, lovely, stupendous, amazing Dan Abnett. Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me back after my performances in the past.
Oh, well, the clamor for you to come back on. I get so much trouble for reading so slowly. So I think everyone's going to be really happy to have you back. And you're my first Black Library author interview of 2025. So fantastic start. We're talking about Prospero Burns,
There we go.
about the Space Wolves, which is set on a snowy ice planet. So very apt for this time of year. Um, so let's start with this is 2011. So a long, long time ago. And this was paired after, the High Lords of Terror had come together, Black Library authors, to discuss how the heresy was going to be dissected. And we had Graham McNeil taking on various parts of it, and you got to take another part on. And it's kind of very much a collaboration between authors coming together.
Mm.
But I think I was scouting around a little bit on the internet, and this one, there was some kind of delay in timing. And I think it was something to do with you got a diagnosis around this time.
It was. It is. Now I'm racking my brains. I'm going to try and be my sparkling best. Interestingly, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but for some reason I did not sleep a wink last night. The full moon kept me. Ironically, the wolf moon
Oh my goodness.
kept
Oh,
me awake last night, and I don't suffer from insomnia, so I clearly knew what we were going to be talking about today. So if I feel dull-witted, that's why. But yes, I think Prospero Burns, if I'm right, was book 15, so it's comparatively early on. And
yes.
in those very early days, we were very much, a roundtable discussion, planning out stuff, and then separating off to write the individual books, but always feeding back to the center. And the first three, obviously, which we've discussed before, were very much a sort of that sort of partnership. But me writing the first one, and Graham writing the second one, that he'd started before I'd finished, so we were
Hmm.
as he described it, I was throwing tennis balls into the air for him to smash and this kind of stuff. By the time we got to this point in the series, we had very much got into the process of all of us gathering together, working out what had to happen next, and then somebody would go away and write that and then feed it back to the group. But with Prospero, we definitely wanted it to be. And in fact, I can't even remember now who suggested this in the first place, but it did, as you say, come from the High Lords. The idea that it should be a pair of books, and we had an opportunity to show one of the early clashes from the point of view of the two sides, because we thought that was very useful thing to do in that stage of the Heresy series
Yeah.
before lines, I suppose, had really been properly drawn, and that we were sort of neutrally invested with everybody before we had to choose whether we wanted to be a traitor or a loyalist or whatever. And not
Mm.
the authors, I mean the audience in general.
Yeah,
So
we know what the authors are. We know what they are.
yes, we know what we are. Yeah, and so it was decided that Graham and I would write these books, and
Yeah.
that was great. And I remember saying at the meeting, I've told this story before. I apologise, but I haven't told it to you necessarily, so I don't apologise. I wanted to write The Thousand Suns,
Yeah.
and Graham went, "Great, I want to write The Space Wolves." So that was the way we were going to divide it up the first way around. Now,
Yes.
this,
Even in your book, Graham got his book at the front with
yeah,
Russ.
that's
So,
right.
yep, there you go.
So that was the way we are going to write it, and anyway, and one of the reasons that had driven me to that decision is that I love all things Warhammer, absolutely love all things Warhammer, but there are certain aspects of the game
Mm.
that I think are harder to translate into what might be described as convincing fiction. If you're going to try and write a serious novel, there are
Yeah.
certain things that are quite difficult to translate. Two examples of those would be orcs,
Yeah.
which are brilliant on the tabletop and so much fun, but it's quite difficult to put them in a novel without making it a comedy novel if you
Mm.
stick to the portrayal of the orcs on the tabletop. And likewise, you then have to change the orcs quite a lot from so. And the other one is the space wolves, because the idea that they are sort of Viking barbarians in space.
Mm.
I mean, absolutely fantastic, brilliant. And Bill King did a brilliant job of writing them early on. But I went. The reason I want to write Thousand Suns is because I think I could do a serious sort of a novel like, for instance, Legion, like I did with the Alpha Legion,
Yeah.
about the Thousand Suns. But I didn't think I could do it about the Space Wolves because I found them faintly amusing and didn't know how to successfully integrate the larger than life aspect of them that is prevalent in the game, the rules, into what was turning into an increasingly serious series of novels without unbalancing one or the other.
Mm.
Anyway, so I
Yeah.
said, "Can I do the Thousand Suns?" But as I started to work on my version of the Thousand Suns novel, I realised that obviously the Space Wolves had to be in it,
Mm.
and so even dealing with them as the adversaries in a novel, I was finding quite difficult to get my head around. And I finally said it because we was early on, we hadn't started writing properly. And I said to Graham, "Can we swap?" I said, because if I've got to get my head around it, I might as well get my head around it in the hardest possible way, which is to write the Space Wolf side of it.
Yeah.
And he went, great, because he really wanted to write Thousand Suns. So we swapped over. So I deliberately set myself this ridiculous challenge of trying to write the Space Wolves. Now, sorry, I'm digressing massively from your question, but I'll get
No,
there.
no, this is why we come here. We love this. Carry on.
So I started doing this, and I was trying to find a way of writing the Space Wolves as a sort of it's so difficult to describe it, but as a kind of convincing, authentic science fiction concept in a serious way, in a serious series of novels, that did not alter them so much from the wonderful thing that they were in the game,
Mm.
but also didn't disrupt the Horus Heresy series, which at that point had got sort of this sort of ambitions to be quite serious and sort of mature in its approach by suddenly having these cartoon barbarians turning up, and so I devised it because it was the heresy. We had a certain amount of latitude to say this is what they were like then.
Yes.
This is the predecessor. That's why I went into such effort to try and evolve this sort of quasi sort of Scandinavian
Mm.
culture and present them in a way that was quite different, yet I hope fitted with.
Yeah.
You could see this was the precursor of where that was going. So there was a lot of work going on in that. As a result, so to me it was and again probably come to this later, but to me the novels were more about why it was going on as much as what happened. It wasn't going to be a battle report. It wasn't going to be, and the Battle of Prospero starts on page one, and we then see it blow by blow. So that's why we had the narrative structure that we did, and it was as much about the character as observing it, our sort of quasi remembrance of character, and as a result. I have learned, see, of all my Horus Heresy novels, that is Prospero Burns is the most Marmite. The others are generally beloved, I've discovered. Everybody loves it. Prospero Burns, you either adore Prospero Burns as your favorite, or
Yeah.
you hate it with a vengeance as hot as the living sun.
Well, let me read this quote to you from our bye to Ian. Our
Yeah.
Ian said, I feel this is one of the most loved books of the whole series. Comedy Vikings are transported to an adult sci-fi believable thing. So
Oh,
I
job done.
there you go. We can end the interview. But
That was good. Well, no, they actually, because I can answer your question because I was writing the novel and I wanted it to be sort of slightly off the nose, sort of obliquely angled to what the novel was, people would imagine the novel was about. So it wasn't strictly the battle, although we do get to the battle. It was, and I knew that Graham was covering an awful lot in
yeah.
Thousand Suns. So I wanted it to be this exploration of what their culture felt like then, how that culture possibly might relate to the Space Wolves we know and love today, and
Mm.
also see it through this unreliable narrator and learn more about the universe. So all those things I was doing. Now, as you point out, in the middle of all of this, I had to stop work because I had a fairly serious diagnosis. This was 2011. I suddenly suffered a series of seizures
Oh.
and collapsed, and it was all very scary. I didn't know anything about it because I was enjoying having seizures. But yeah, I was taken to hospital and underwent tests and all this kind of stuff. They had no idea what was wrong with me, but yeah, but so that they didn't know what it was, and they said, well, you've got to. There's something going on. We need to do CAT scans. We need to diagnose what this is, and et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera, which was a process that took several months.
Wow.
And they said, in the meantime, what you need to do is, take these pills, which are anticonvulsants, that will calm you down,
Yeah.
and just basically try and the term they use is to keep your thresholds low. So do not get tired, do not work too hard, do not get overexcited, do not drink too much, do all sorts of,
Yeah.
basically don't do anything that might set a seizure off. So
Don't
I
do
suddenly became
Warhammerish.
no. So and this happened right in the well early on in the writing of that, and during the same period I was writing a non-Warhammer novel called see, I was tired last night. What's my science fiction novel called?
Which one, Dan?
Embedded, the one I wrote for
Yeah.
Andrew Rober. Um, both of which were
That,
written
that
sort
in
of
here somewhere.
during this strange period of a slightly altered state because it is a very I was learning what the because seizures are very strange.
Hmm.
I'll skip to the end of the story so it's a happier story as I tell it. After about 3 months, I was taken to see a specialist because during that 3 months it could have been anything. It could have been a brain tumor. It could have been something completely
Oh my
terminal.
gosh, I can't
So,
imagine.
and I was very, very calm about it. And it was just like, this is very interesting. So finally, the specialist said to me, he took me in and said, well, Mr. Abbott, he said, it's just epilepsy. Thinking that I'd be shocked. And I went, hooray! I said, and he said, yes, take these pills for the rest of your life and you'll be fine. So it was just epilepsy. And apparently I had always had it. I'd been born with it. I had, as a child, I'd suffered from night terrors, what I thought were night terrors, but
Hmm.
actually it was seizures in my sleep. So it had been, for the
Hmm.
rest of my life, it had been nocturnal epilepsy, where you have seizures in your sleep. And finally, at the whatever age I was in 2011, I finally had one in daylight hours, and that was noticed, and that was led to the diagnosis. So it had always been there. So it um, drastically changed a lot of things. Actually, it had a big effect on my life in terms of my sleeping patterns and all sorts of things like that. So that in many respects, very good things. I sort of became much more disciplined, but also much calmer.
Hmm.
All sorts of very positive things came out of it. But it was a weird time. It was a very weird time, and I didn't hide it. I didn't not talk to people about it. In fact, I talked to when I was at conventions, I would talk to people about this is going on. This is why the book's been delayed.
Yeah.
This is what's going on because I felt it was the sort of thing where the epilepsy is comparatively common. So let's talk about it. Let's
Yeah.
talk about it. Let's increase the awareness of that. And afterwards, some years afterwards, in the years following the publication of both Prospero Burns and Embedded, people came up to me and they said, we've heard you talk about epilepsy. It's really interesting because it's like you were writing about it in those books. And I went, was I? And I went back and looked at them and realized that actually there is loads of stuff in Prospero Burns that I was not consciously doing, and in Embedded too, about being out of your body, about strange altered states of being, about unreliable memory, about all sorts of things like that, which are clearly referencing the
Oh,
experiences I was having. So Hauser in the story is sort of channeling me or vice versa, which because I was actually putting my experience, but I wasn't doing delivery. I was thinking, I wasn't sitting there going, well, I've now got epilepsy. I'm going to put this in my book. It was
no.
just coming out sort of because the seizures do that. For instance, when you suffer a seizure, or when I suffer a seizure, I knew one was about to happen because I would be able to smell a smell that I was really distinctive, but did not relate to any smell I'd ever smelled. My wife ended up calling it I could smell the inside of my own head. It was like, oh, that's that smell. What's that smell? Oh, I'm going to have a seizure. And
Oh,
then when I came out of the seizure, I could not remember. I'd have a memory gap of about 2 or 3 hours. So there was this displacement effect of weirdness,
mm,
and this went on. But actually, not a pleasant thing to undergo a grand mal seizure, but also it was really interesting once I was aware of what was happening and look at them and understand the signs and the processes and how the recovery and how your memory sort of filtered back, but some of it was still missing and all sorts of things like that, and relating it back through my life and realizing this had been going on for a long time. And it got to the point where once I was on I went through several medications, and finally they put me on the one that was suitable for my kind of epilepsy, which I've been on since, and never had a seizure since. So it's perfectly controlled. But I went back to see the specialist after a year, and I said, and he asked me various questions, and he said he it was some of the questions he asked me were things like, "Do you suffer from deja vu?" He said, first of all, he said, "Have you had any more seizures?" And I said, "No, I haven't." So the med's working. He says, "Great." So I said, "I'd quite like to get my driving license back and be able to do all those things." He
Yeah.
said, "Well, that's perfectly fine." He said, "But let me ask you some other questions." He said, "Do you suffer from deja vu?" And I said, "Well, I do, and I do more now than I did
Before.
before." And I said, also, I get this feeling, increasing feeling every now and then, just of a sort of warm, happy feeling of nostalgia, like
Hmm.
I'm remembering something happening, it was a really great feeling of well-being. And he said, okay, he said, well, you're still having micro seizures. Those are traces of micro seizures. So he said, you've got a choice at this point. He said you can slightly increase the dosage of the medication, which will make those things stop, which
Mhm.
will allow me to authorize you to get your driving license back, because at the moment you can't have it back. You've got to stick to buses and trains. Or he said, you can leave it where it is because it's not affecting you. In fact, it's having a benevolent effect on your life. And I said, oh, really? He said, yes. He said, a lot of people, when they reach this stage of recovery and they're getting these feelings of deja vu and
Hmm.
happy nostalgia, they elect not to ever drive again because they want to keep that state. And I could believe it. As
Yeah.
it was, because I was the only driver in the family, I did step up my meds and sort
Yeah.
myself out like that. But it was really interesting that the idea that what people would consider to be a frightening disease or illness or condition, uh, there came a point where it was controlled to such an extent where I could sort of enjoy part of it and was given the option of continuing to enjoy part of it.
Mhm.
And that was very much all those weird feelings, things like deja vu, were related to memory and
Yeah. Yeah.
faked memory and not being able to trust things, which again are all the things that are in the book. And I
Yeah. I
didn't
think
know I was writing about.
as you were talking about the deja vu, it's like all those times, Hawser was waking up and the regicide board was there and he was looking out the
Yeah.
window, very, very, very much t tied in. And
Yeah, but absolutely not deliberate. I mean, completely not deliberate. It was only when various people pointed that out to me, and there are similar things in Embedded. They pointed it out to me afterwards, and I went, "No, I didn't." And I went back and I went, "Oh, I absolutely did. I absolutely did."
well, thank you. I'm glad you let me ask about that because that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I don't want to be trite, about what you've just told me, but I think we've always known you've got a very exceptional brain that comes up with all kinds of fucked up, crazy shit. Pardon my
We-
French. So,
No, I think we have. And actually there is I mean it is interesting because epilepsy can cause people, it can be very, very serious, it can be very,
mm,
very frightening, it can cause enormous problems to people's lives, but actually it is unusual in as much as historically, and going right the way back into ancient times,
yeah.
it has always been a condition that has been treated with a certain degree of reverence. It's marked people out as sort of special. There's a lot of very major historical figures, particularly artists and creators, who we now know were epileptic because
Mm.
it was seen by people as being proof of some kind of weird divine thing happening to them. So I'm not claiming that for myself, but I'd like to sometimes think, yeah, that's what's happening. I'm the shaman. That's
You are my shaman. I'd take you out in the woods anytime. God to us. So there's a really lovely little dedication in this book. And it says belatedly for Evan McNeil. Is that baby McNeil?
That is Baby McNeil. A Baby McNeil as was then, yes.
I just thought, oh, that's really cute. And then I read the book and I was like, that's horrific. That it's to a baby. How could you? And then we get a lovely Magnus quote in here. Because bless Magnus. If I'm
Mhm.
guilty of anything, it is the simple pursuit of knowledge, the primariness at Nakia. And I really, really loved that because obviously, you know, we have the whole Magnus didn't do anything wrong thing going on,
Yeah.
which will,
Now that's an yeah, which is obviously a beat we have to play on. I have to say that I over the years have really come down to the conclusion that Magnus did an awful lot of things wrong.
really,
Yes, and one of the reasons I say that is because unfortunately the phrase "somebody didn't do anything wrong" is borrowed from a rather unfortunate part of history,
okay,
not
yeah,
my doing. So I tend to, but yeah, I think that central um
the conceit is
argument.
Yeah.
argument about whether the Thousand Sons and Magnus were doing the right thing or trying their best to do the right thing, and it
Yeah.
went horribly wrong, and they suffered a terrible punishment. And the idea of the wolves being really the dedicated executioners amongst they are the legion you send when you want something crushed, which seem to fit so beautifully. I think that is absolutely still valid, and I actually am very happy to entertain arguments for the Magnus was doing the right thing and they were unjustly punished. The extent to where Magnus goes as a result of having his
Mm.
punishment is then questionable. You'd think
Yes.
if he felt he was genuinely innocent of these crimes, he would find other courses of action to take. But nevertheless, yes, it is that interesting thing because it is not really. I mean, it's a long way before, but it's not really the more conventional Horus Heresy split of chaos traitors versus imperial loyalists. It's
Yeah.
not it's not that. It's the division, no matter what else is going on, is nothing like as clean cut when it comes to this particular clash. this
Yeah.
is this is possibly an overreaction on both parts. The Thousand Sons and Magnus, their hands are clearly not clean because they're already dabbling in things that are too dangerous, and they've probably been told not to do that.
Yeah.
But
Dad said
then
don't do it.
so are the wolves. So
Yes.
are the wolves, and they're justifying it in all sorts of different ways. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I mean, we've had a couple of books now. I think Graham did it beautifully. Teenage Tantrum Magnus. And then and then we went into what was the
That
book?
should be an animated series.
I know. But I want to have Primark babies like Muppet Babies as a series. Going on that. And then we had First Heretic and we had Teenage Tantrum there because Big Brother got
Yeah,
sent to, you know,
yeah.
and that's very powerful when you're a Primark dabbling in dodgy things, unfortunately. So
It
I
is,
thought,
it is, and I think that's a thing that we that our attitude towards possibly and in a really good way evolved in the course of writing the entire Horus Heresy, because early on, because that's the way the whole thing was set up. They were kind of, each Primarch was an archetype embodying
mm,
often a particular passion or ideal,
yeah,
or force. And then so we tended to treat them like some kind of Greek pantheon, where the god of anger would be angry all the time, and this
yeah,
kind of stuff. And therefore, when these teenage tantrums occurred, it was like, well, he would do that because that's what happened in Olympus, and
yeah,
by which I mean Greek Olympus. It seemed fitting to the myth. But the further you go on, the more you get to that, you're getting, wait a minute, you're meant to be the demigods leading the human race. That's kind of unacceptable behavior, even if you are, for instance, a god of anger and that kind of stuff.
yeah.
So it was like, so that kind of working out that. Weirdly, the bigger, more powerful, and more dangerous they became as the heresy went on, and that applies to the loyalists too. The more we tried to make sure that their humanity came through, because otherwise it was getting a bit kind of, oh my God, why did you put these people in charge?
Yeah.
Because the slightest thing and he's going to hit you with an axe. And I think by the time we get to, dare I say it, the Siege of Terror, and
Yeah.
books like The End of the Death, that's why I spent some time in there, for instance, talking about why Sanguinius in The End of the Death talks to the Emperor about why they were permitted to retain emotions from their
Oh,
original
I'm
human
so
states,
glad you wrote that. I can,
and all of that sort of stuff. So it was like, this is I won't go into the explanation now. People can read it and find out that, but I think it's a good, convincing explanation of why he did that. It wasn't a terrible mistake. There was actually a really practical reason for it, and above and beyond just wanting them to retain some sense of humanity to the species they were attached to. But I think in hindsight, it explains the almost operatic human emotion that explodes out of people, the teenage tantrum moments, because that's the way they were coded to be. They were designed that way. They aren't design flaws. They
yeah.
were, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Can
that,
I
yeah.
just say something in my body, some organ or diaphragm has relaxed after 15 books, that there is that conversation. Because after every book, at the moment, I really love the Emperor and I think he's doing his best. And I think Graham made me cry because in the last book, I think Magnus smashes up the webway and he comes in when he shouldn't. And I think he just says, Father. And I was
Yeah,
like, "Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I'm so cool.
And and in terms of Magnus, I think again that is also amplified because I think we possibly all subconsciously, unless we were actually writing in the voice of a traitor, we
Yeah,
were playing up the idea that for all his apparent faults, the Emperor was the good guy for such a long time through the
yeah,
course of the Horus Heresy. And it's only when you get to the the siege, really, where
Yeah.
you're surrounded by the propaganda of the traitors who by then have just gone into a frenzy, that I think the readers are starting to go, is he really? I mean, God, and you realize that just like the relationships with everybody else, the Emperor is just a bigger version of Magnus. That is to say, he has the same kind of tantrums
Yeah.
and why wouldn't Magnus? Because Magnus is, of course, his son. And that idea that everything is a much more coded shade of grey. And again, one of the reasons the end of death, which I keep referring to, but one of the reasons that was written from the point of view of so many different voices was
Yeah.
to get all those different arguments side by side without saying this is the right one. It's to
Yeah.
just put them side by side so you can choose the ones that made sense to you. But in doing that, you still, I hope, unless you're just a complete traitor fan, you're still siding with the Emperor no matter what his faults,
Yeah.
because the alternative is so terrible. Because by
Yeah.
that stage, of course, Horus and the others are just quite beyond
No
any
redemption.
no redemption and no negotiation and nothing.
Yeah.
They have become their monstrous selves. You know, so it's
Well,
like, well, the argument is now invalid because it's either this guy or eternal horror. So you know,
yeah.
and I think that's a really really
A
so
compelling argument.
it's almost like it's like the whole series of books I think is almost like Russian dolls in reverse, that it's just each stage is a bigger doll containing the previous ones, and the same themes and the same shape is there, and you're going, oh, it's these guys too. Oh, and his dad. Oh, and you know, it sort of goes
Yeah.
up and up and up like that until you realize the whole thing is a gigantic echo of the initial
I mean,
problem.
no one can, it's so hard to break the generational chains of trauma, especially when the warp's involved in the mix. And
Well, yes.
I always back the wrong ones. Like, I remember when I read Fulgrim, I was like, but they could get the demon out of him and save him. And then
Yeah.
that went quite dark. And then I got the Emperor inspect, making him a
Excellent.
figure of fun, you know.
Yeah. I think that's it, and I think I mean, hopefully we've not only us writers at the Black Library, but also the Games Workshop itself, in terms of designing the game and creating the
Mm.
lore, have done a good job of saying, yeah, a character like, for example, Horus, irredeemably bad and terrible, but also he's fascinating, he's exciting, he's
Yeah.
charismatic. You can still like him as a character. You don't have to.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think people who go, oh, I'm absolutely chaos down the line. I'm going, yes, of course you are, because this is a universe and a game that invites you to choose sides and almost to um, LARP as, or, role play
Yeah.
as either, sort of an angelic being or whatever, and so do that, really get
Yeah.
invested in that. With people, we don't give sidelong glances to people who decide to be Tyranid players just because they're going to eat everybody, because that's part of the
You don't.
wonder of this. No, well. But you know what I mean? It's part of the wonder of
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
This is a way of I think it's too easy to sort of to be critical of people who are very much saying, oh, Horus was right
yeah.
and should have triumphed, because yes, that is a perfectly valid way of looking at it, and it doesn't mean to say that they wanted the galaxy to burn. It's just that they are enjoying that. It's like rooting for the bad guys. It's like rooting for Alan Rickman in Die Hard.
Yeah.
It's you can't help it.
Yeah. No, I think the magnificent job has been made, and because we're still discussing it, 20 odd years later.
I
So
know.
we were still only on the quote stand. Look what happens
I
when
know. Yeah. Sorry
we
about
will talk
that.
about Space Wolves, everybody, don't worry. We've got this gorgeous oft quoted Shakespeare quote as well. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere pugnacy. The bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should become the lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead, etc. So this is
Hmm.
a nice little piece from Troilus and Cressidas,
Yes, Troy is
um,
interested. Yeah. Hmm.
Shakespeare
Yeah.
quote, and we've got quite a lot of Shakespeare kind of seeping into the saga, which is so, it makes
Hmm.
perfect sense. So we've got Caliban, which is where the knights live, and then Prospero, the name of the planet.
Yeah.
Was that a discussed, how is Shakespeare sitting alongside the Lord of Terror discussions, or is that something that seeps in, or how? Because it
I well,
seeps through.
it's a little bit of both. I think we did discuss those sorts of things. I think we also independently went away and went, this is still meant to be a continuation of the human culture, even though it's a ridiculously long way in the future, and
Yes.
that it would be quite fun if there was certain recognizable or quasi-recognizable things that a modern audience would go, oh God, I know what that is. Even if we don't spell Shakespeare right or we misname his poem, I think the same thing happens in it's either No No Fear or Unremembered Empire, where there are lots of quotes from Hamlet, but it's not.
Mm.
It's called Amulet, Prince of Denmark, and
Oh, I'm excited to look at that.
because in that one it starts in a very Hamlet-esque thing with Gilliman with sort of stalking the battlements of a haunted castle, and all this kind of stuff. And so there's really strong parallels, and I think yes, there's a certain amount of fake gravitas that you can attach to that, but it's true all the way through. Those little sort of sidelong references to things that might have survived. And in fact, again, during the Siege of Terror, I was writing stuff, and my editor said, "I think you're putting too many of them in." And I said, "Am I really?" Not just Shakespeare, but sort of contorted versions of real world references.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, I'll take some of them out." And he said, "No, it's just that because all of them are obviously, from our point of view, taken from history, recognizable history from the 21st century backwards. What you need to do is add some in that happened that are history that we don't know about because it hasn't happened yet." And I went, "Oh yes, you're right. That's because it's such a stupid idea that
Yeah.
everything they will be quoting would come from our time period or before. So that's why in some of the later books there are these references to things that seem just as solemn and important, but
Mm.
actually you're going, I don't know what that is, and it's because you don't know what that is yet because it's not going to happen for another 6,000 years or whatever." So
I love it. I love it. Well, you certainly have taken a lot of inspiration for this book, and you do get to write a little bit about ancient Egypt because our hero is an explorer. So all that research wasn't wasted. And I thought that was quite lovely that you got to, the same way I guess Graham got to in his. Um,
yes.
so one theme I noticed throughout the book in this is a lot around eyes. And
Mm,
firstly, the awful twist at the beginning when you think, oh, fantastic, there's just been this horrible massacre and our protagonist has been saved. And then this big space marine just squooshes an eye out. How
hmm
clear is that? Um, and yeah, so the stuff around the eyes and the eyes being a symbol of protection, do
Yeah.
you remember that where that came from?
I think we always, all of us authors, looking at each legion in turn and the imagery and the things that might be associated to that. I mean, eyes are particularly important because this is a book about uh, seeing and observing. It's about witnessing. It's about
Yeah.
unreliable witnessing. So hence one eye and not
Yes.
another eye. For example, there is a hint of Odin with the eye patch in there. There is the Eye of Horus, the protecting ward of the eye that Eye of Horus has become. The Eye of Terror. I mean, how many more eyes do you need? Do you know what I mean? It's like the eye is that's it. It's about being able to see. I mean, part
Yeah.
of what drives Magnus to take the steps he does is because he has witnessed something.
Mm.
So, if he hadn't seen it, he wouldn't have done anything in that situation. So again, it is that whole thing. And we had already begun a strand of things like the remembrances
Yeah.
and the idea that these things should be observed and they should be recorded as myths, as true as
Mm.
possible, except that the closer you get to the heart of them, the harder it is to record a truth or to record
Yes.
that. So we've seen that in Horus Rising, etc., with Cinderman and everybody like that, and now we see it again here. So there is that sense um, uh, of even on the ground level, when it's
Mm.
happening around you, you are unreliable as a recording of this, which is why I suppose our great excuse of why there are sort of so many subtly different, tonally different, and sometimes factually contradictory versions of the Horus Heresy,
Yeah.
because we're looking at it, I suppose, from the viewpoint of 40k. So
Mm.
10,000 years later, and it's like here are all the different legends. In the same way that you look these days at, if you want to read the legend of King Arthur, which if it happened at all, happened, sort of 1,500 years ago,
Mm.
perhaps. There are so many different source materials of that legend that you can go to, and they are massively contradictory
Yeah.
depending on which version you take. I mean, did this all come out of the lake? Did it come out of the stone? What were the names of his knights? Where did he do this? What, let's bolt on the male griff. Here's Lancelot. There are so many different versions. If there was a story there at all, and I like the idea that the Horus Heresy has that kind of quality, which also allowed us, of course, sneakily to get around those few places where in the lore itself there are at least two different versions of something. We go, oh, which
Yeah.
one should we do? Well, can we not suggest actually both of them? And this the way that history has recorded it.
I mean, what I love about you, Dan, is I can ask a little question like, "There's lots of eyes
And
in
I
it."
just go on for hours.
It's such a golden answer. I mean, I'm just looking around for somebody sent me this fabulous author, I'll put his name below, who's written a whole Arthurian trilogy, Space Marines, if they were, King
Hmm.
Arthur. But you really spoil me for any other interviews, Dan. I have to, I'm like, what do you mean you're not going to talk for, 20 on this? One conceit I loved was the conservatory, which is
Hmm.
Hawes's job really, and the fact that somebody really cares about, well, what made, the night happen? Why did it all go so horribly wrong? Because I had this horrible, the fact that come 40K, we don't want to look back at anything, so the fact that there was some kind of like, let's pull things together and let's see what we can find, only for that to be besmirched by the
Hmm.
demons again. Um,
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that. Um,
I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think that's the whole idea. I mean, there's that you get that weird that again. That's a building theme throughout the entire series of the idea that they must try in the name of both fairness
yeah,
and of protection, gather as much information and record as much as what's happened and save art and save history and save all these sorts of things until they
yeah.
get to the point where they have stockpiled it to such an extent where they're going, we're going to have to start burning some of this stuff because it's so dangerous. Because the
Mm,
more we thought, the more we knew, the more we were safeguarded. But actually, some of these things are too dangerous to know. So where do you draw that line?
yeah.
Hence, I don't know, the Inquisition later on. But it is that wonderful. It's not just a case of history is written by the victors, and therefore you get the sanitized version or the loyalist version. It's like history is carefully redacted by
Mm.
those in charge, so that some of these landmines don't go off, which is
Oh no, I mean it did give me a joy in my heart to see them collecting before it was smashed at the end. So thank you for that.
yes.
Um, and then I mean you went really deep into the Vikings. I got a question from somebody specifically about this. I'm just looking up, got so many questions. I think it was Caprice who was asking about all the research around the Viking culture and how deeply you went into that. And it's quite brutal at the beginning. I just want to thank God I'm inured by Gaunt's ghost, she said to an invisibility. This is just a slight one. I'm not reading the one where someone got struck by an axe and it caught on his collarbone and you hear about that experience. Um, A bolt spear punctured him right through and tore him open so thoroughly his gut. I can't. Gut, his gut. This Dan, we come here so often. This is awful. This is really horrible. A bolt spear punctured him right through and tore him open so thoroughly his guts spilled out onto the snow like ropes of sausage. Gedge tried to catch them as though he could gather them up and put them back inside himself, and everything would be all right again. They steamed in the spring air. He squealed in dismayed pain. He couldn't help himself. He knew he was ruined unto death.
There you go.
I mean, Dan strikes again, and there was this beautiful moment later in the book that I really felt represented me, and it was these little cherubim servitors somewhere, and they were just floating around as usual. And I think a space wolf or someone came in going, "Grr," and the little cherubs went, "Ee," and they flew up. So I
So
thought,
that grisly account that you quote there, though, somebody, Caprice, I think, asked the question about the research. So, as ever, I am a devil for it. I will, as I've said before, I do an awful lot of research about the closest real world equivalent that I can find to the things I'm writing about,
yes,
so that I can sort of deeply inhale of the flavor of that thing, and then I go move sideways, and it doesn't have to be uh real at that point. It doesn't have to be authentic. It doesn't have to be uh proper. I'm not pretending for a moment that the language that I'm using is not
yeah,
anything other than it's invented, but it has to have the right flavor to it. So it has to. So just researching the way the languages work, so they sound right, even if they are not genuinely. I mean, because they are not. They are my invention. They are
yeah,
based on that. So all of those sorts of things. So the way that things are described, the way that the cultural specifics, the customs, the
mm,
sort of the leather armor, the words they have for themselves, all of these sorts of things are sort of semi borrows or inspired by the things that I read up about Vikings. I didn't want literally them to be Vikings and have some kind of authentic, detailed, complete copy of Viking culture there where people could actually go, oh, this is exactly like it was archaeologically speaking.
yeah,
No, it just had to feel like that's what it was so that it worked. And that description, oddly enough, if you read the sagas and you read Anglo-Saxon poems, for
Are
instance, like
we
the Battle of
talking
Malden.
about Beowulf as well, but maybe a bit more?
Beowulf, absolutely, yeah. Beowulf, the Battle of Malden, all things like that. When they are recounting battles, they are incredibly graphic when it comes
Mm,
to. So that description is almost completely almost like a pastiche of the things that are written about,
yes.
where somebody is wounded and they fall upon the ground and it is like this, and they are wounded. It is deliberately echoing, evoking the idea of the fact that the sagas did not pull any punches when they told you about the stories. And that particular thing, not to go into the gory details literally again, but the whole idea of the guts coming out, that in itself is I'm not going to call it a trope, but that is a recurring thing when you read accounts of genuine combat going right the way through to the 21st century, but certainly Second World War, First World War, intestinal injuries, the number of soldiers who, because it seldom kills you outright immediately, although it's horrible and painful. The idea that they've gone, oh, and they try and put themselves back together again because they think they can at that point. It is, I thought that's what makes these horrible events
Yeah. I mean,
feel
this,
real, because these are real human beings.
yeah,
And that's absolutely not the same as like, oh look, a giant space marine, oh Big Bang with it, and he's fallen down and all that kind of stuff. You want people to understand that this is war, and it is awful. It's
yeah.
absolutely awful.
I mean, I've read a lot of Dan Abnett. I think this is the goriest. I think it's the most, I suppose Space Wolves are very much Malay. They're close up, it's all very,
Yeah. Yes, it
and
probably.
and
Yes, it
there's,
probably is. I don't know. No, no fear
let
comes
me let
close
me
in
just
a
give you
couple of
some more
places.
evidence for this.
Oh yeah, okay. Go on.
Beef could smell blood. It was overpoweringly strong, a hot copper reek spicing the freezing dawn air. Amazing writing, as usual. He could smell Gedge's insides too. He could smell the inner parts of him, the ruptured stomach, the yellow fat of his belly meat, the heat of his life. I mean, this is very visceral. If you've written something worse than this, please direct me away from it.
I don't. No, I probably have. I think I think it gets. I think the violence and horror in Prospero Burns, as you say, because it is about Vikings, it's about blades and it's about close
Yeah.
combat. Therefore, the
And
horror
fake
is
fake.
very.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
magic and warpery and
No,
stuff.
exactly. And I think therefore the horror is very anatomical. So you get descriptions like that, which are probably I think there are some just ridiculously shocking moments of violence in some of the other books where things happen, but they're probably more kind of like, oh my, it's the difference between um a sort of splatter horror movie and a shock horror movie. Do you know what I mean? I think there's so
Yeah.
I was thinking about there's immense amounts of violence in No No Fear, for instance, because of the nature of the book.
Oh
And
no,
there's some some
really?
some some notorious moments of
This
how
one.
these things happen.
Oh.
But I think it's placed I think it's placed in the context of a sort of, it's more like the astonishing violence of, say, a big disaster movie,
Yeah.
rather than
Yes.
this, which is this the Prospero Bones is much more the sort of horror of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's like, oh my God, I have to look away because it's squeamish horror rather
Yeah.
than sort of that sort of broader sense of panicking horror. I think there is a difference there. So I would agree with that. But again, the bit you just read out, very much deliberately written to ape the style of the way the sagas talked
Yeah.
so matter of factly. And you could see it even in like, sort of the sort of sort of carvings, and even up to things like the Bayeux Tapestry and medieval pictures of warfare, where they're quite happy to show, oh, he's got an arrow in his eye, or oh, he's got a
Yes.
pipe
Yes.
rammed up his ass. They take great delight in going, this is what
Yeah.
happens to you. And, sort of,
Yeah.
they're cutting his limbs off, they are hacking off upon his limbs, and you go, yes, because that was their equivalent of the newspapers, and they're going, so what exactly happened to King Egwide? Well, they took him into the marsh, and thereupon they hacked upon his legs, and you go,
Oh,
oh, okay, then have you got a picture? I've drawn one for you.
let me stitch that.
No, yes.
No, I mean, I think it is gloriously grotesque and, I mean, immensely proud of myself for reading through, but it really does capture the whole feel because we are jumping from, chapter to chapter, and it does feel completely wholly different. The freezing cold of the whole saga of, this small group of little planet
Yeah.
inhabitants thinking they were safe, and then all their neighbors coming after them,
Yeah.
I thought
And
it was,
that is meant very much a contrast with the Thousand Suns, which is obviously very
yes,
hot place, hot and dry, not cold and wet. With their weapons and their technology, being able to just do just as much killing and murdering, but in a kind of romantic, I'm going to zap you from a distance type way. And again, difference from, I'll just use it as an example, but the kind of wet work you see the Alpha Legion doing in legion.
Yes, yes,
That's we're talking about the characteristics of legions here. And if it helps you any, when you read those two excerpts back out of those particularly gory bits,
yeah.
I was going, yeah, they still make me wince. They made me wince when I wrote them. That's why I wrote them, because they were meant to make people go, oh, that's nasty. Oh, that's a nasty way of putting it.
Yeah, I can't imagine what your night terrors consist of. So I should say, that question was from Homie One Kenobi, not Caprice. Caprice has got a question further along.
Okay.
He just said, were the Space Wars an easier nut to crack, as in cultural practices and the flavour of them, and the extent of Lehman Russ and Fenris? So I feel like you did that deep dive, and we had all the
I
saga.
sort of did, yeah. I suppose in some respects they were easy though. Just to clarify that, except in the context of doing it in this particular way, where that was so difficult to balance those things out.
Yeah. My friend Jim, Historicus Jim, he liked your kennings, which are made up words. So, for example, murder make and things like this.
Yeah. Yes.
And again, really, I was really loving, the way that they speak. And there's much more grunting, and the way Lehman speaks is so
Hmm.
different to how Fulgrim speaks or Valdor, who pop up in this,
Exactly.
which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah,
and
those kennings, those compound words, of course, when you read a translation, particularly of the Norse, but it also is occasionally in things like Anglo-Saxon and Middle English, is the idea that they will talk about something by compressing two
mm,
words together. It's so beautifully simple and straightforward, and it's like, well, that's how they should talk. Then
yeah,
that's how they can describe things. They don't have a fancy word for things. They will compress words together. They will force words together in
yeah.
order to get across, and it's so much more immediate.
Yeah, it matches the brutality of the Space Wolves for sure. I mean, you really love dabbling in languages. I was excited to recognize, there's a bit where House's friend Mirza is trying to convince him to come and look at this cult he's found. Never a good thing to do in the universe. And Annuncia is used. And
Yes.
I think must have come across that in Eisenhorn right back at the beginning of my journey. And so I really loved, that I always think it's a Dan trope to have like little language dotted throughout.
Hmm.
So yeah, appreciation for that too. And then talking about Caspar Hauser, I mean, I did feel echoes of Legion just because he was basically, he was the born, he was
Hmm.
unknowingly activated. And
Hmm.
when he was looking at a little wooden horse, I was thinking, where have I seen that? And I thought, Blade Runner 2049, the Ryan Gosling character had been told he was real because of the dream of the little horse.
Yes.
So there is a story about the name. Would you tell us that, and why you chose to use that for this book?
Yeah. Well, there are parallels with Legion but I think it's a very different way of handling that kind of character,
Yeah,
particularly a character who is completely oblivious and has lost their memory and their short-term memory, and they can't rely on any of the things that, which obviously goes back to me again. But the story of Caspar Hauser, not spelt the same way that it is spelt, it's usually spelt with a C, Caspar, and Hauser HU, but
yeah,
there is this bizarre story from, I'm trying to remember when the date is, and I don't know why I ended up choosing it, but it's one of those stories. So this man called Caspar Hauser appeared in the court. I think it was just somewhere in Germany. I should have got the information in front of me, but I've known it for years and years and years. He came out of nowhere and claimed that he'd lived in this strange place, but nobody knew where he'd come from. And he
mm,
lived in the court and was an educated and clever person, but it was like a visitation. They didn't know where he'd come from.
yeah,
And then after I think it was several years where he was beloved by people, he was weirdly murdered by unknown parties in a park at night, and so they never found out where he came from or
mm,
where he went to. And it is one of those great sort of Fortean myths of history,
yeah,
stories about who exactly was. It's like the Green Children of Woolpit, and it has recurred through. I mean, there is a brilliant, just for example, Suzanne Vega song about Caspar Hauser, which I've always liked. So it's one of those things. And I thought that's a perfect name for him,
yeah.
particularly spelling his name Hauser as Horser, which of course has the double meaning of being a strong rope to tie you to something. Where it's like, what is the connection here?
Oh,
It's
so good. I mean, I think in a way it's quite good. I mean, if I'd known that the legend of that, then I might have kind of been thinking, oh, hang on a minute, he's called something because of this. But I
Mm,
had no clue. So the reveal, can you imagine the fright of being dragged into an audience with Valdor Fulgrim? You've got the Sisters of Silence there.
mm.
by the way, mate, you are, you're a deep spy for somebody and been activated. I thought that was fantastic. And I think that's the comparison with Legion. There were so many like, oh, what do you mean moments? So that was
Yeah, well, I think there is that, and I hope, and I say this honestly, but then who knows what goes on in one's own head? I certainly don't. But I don't put these references like Casper has. I don't put these things in because I want to show off and go, oh, I'm being so clever. Oh, look at me with my breadth of knowledge that I will put subtly into this.
I think you can't help but bring
I
something out of your
I love that. These are things that fascinate me. So I go, oh, there's a way of weaving that in. That's really, really interesting. And as you say, I don't think it matters that a reader doesn't necessarily get that reference because
yeah.
maybe if they did get that reference, they'd be on guard, as you said,
Hmm.
for what might be going on. But I also love the idea that maybe a reader gets to the end of the book and goes, that's really interesting, and then might go and look something up, look up an unusual word, or look up a name, and go,
Yeah.
oh, wait a minute, that's a sort of Easter egg callback to something that may have really happened. Or, and this is my perfect version of it, is that years afterwards, having read the book, they're reading something one day and they read about Caspar Hauser and they go, wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. That can't be. I just love that idea of leaving these so that
Oh,
there is a sense of a kind of there's a kind of synchronicity that sort of human history and culture and everything that surrounds us and all that kind of stuff. You see little echoes of it in here, and you either see it in the Horus in the books that I write, but the Horus Heresy series, you see these echoes. You might recognize them at the time in the book, or they might be the first time you hear the thing that then makes the echo to the real thing it's referencing years later. I don't care which way around it is. I love the idea that it might sort of make you alert and aware to the lovely weirdness of the world we live in. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. And I suppose with things like Caspar Hauser, and not to bang on about this, but not only is he thematically representative of memory and how much memory he's got and hasn't got, which was my own situation at the time, but it also is the idea that the Caspar Hauser is a character who came out of nowhere. So again, another connection to that. And also that might ring a bell later. So it's deja vu again, which again was something. So I
yeah.
was deja vuing myself without realizing that I was doing it.
Oh, the inception of authors.
Oh
Um,
yes, yes. My entire office is slowly turning around me right now.
oh gosh, can you imagine? So we're coming up to an hour, Dan. How long can I keep you for this evening? Especially if,
We go a little way longer, maybe 10 minutes or so, if that's all
yeah,
right with you.
that's great. I'm really sorry to everybody in the whole world who has a million and one questions. One of
I'll
the
try
things,
and do shorter answers.
oh no, then we lose so much. Okay, there are no wolves on Fenris.
Yeah,
Another quote that echoes into eternity around.
absolutely. Yeah.
So you're now very responsible for this, and we have,
Mm.
a lot of wolves popping up. Like, what's your relation to there are no wolves on Fenris? Like, how did you work around that? Did you know that it was going to kind of emanate out forever and ever and ever?
I didn't necessarily. I mean, I thought it was a great line, and I really like the many implications of what that is telling you. And I'm not actually going to opt for it. I know which ones that I think it is referring to, and I think one of the reasons the line has continued to resonate with people is simply because it's so open to interpretation. Some of those interpretations are really quite sinister. So I think it's one of those lines like "I was there the day the emperor."
Yeah.
It's one of those ones that I'm just really glad that it was a line that has become something to people, no matter what they think it means. So I will not be drawn on what I think it actually means, although I know what it actually means. But I didn't know it would have that kind of
Again,
longevity.
I will ask that you've written this down somewhere in your paper. 'Cause,
Yes.
I've got your annotated, Eisenhorn and things. Eventually,
Well, yes. When they get to the Horus Heresy, maybe I will finally say the yes.
only a few to do. So Nathaniel W, thank you for asking about that. I mean, we got a lot of questions about that. Um, and then oh gosh, we can come back to this when I reread them. I'm sure there's lots of things. Yes, the game of regicide. I know for
Yeah.
me, I loved it, and I thought it was a really clever reference to show how much time had passed. I also thought it was a really clever reflection of the emperor and the dynasty and the game of chess and everything. Is regicide a thing in the Warhammer universe?
Yes, it is because I invented it and I stuck it in. I think it first appears in the Gaunt's Ghost books, and I was referencing back my own 40k continuity into that. Although by then I think other authors had also mentioned regicide and the then boss of Black Library back in that day, Mark Gascoigne, actually worked out the rules of Regicide and printed it up so we all had a copy so you could play Regicide. So
Wow.
there was a sense that it was, yes, it was chess, but there was also a sense of it relating to several other classic ancient board games, including things like Nine Men's Morris and the other ones that the Vikings would have played, which is one of the other references that I wanted to get in there. So yes, Regicide was a thing by then, but that was entirely my fault. And when I invented it, it seemed like a really good substitute name for chess, which is what I really wanted it to be. I didn't want to call it
Yeah.
chess. I called it Regicide. By the time you then extrapolate that backwards to the Horus Heresy, it's like, oh, there's a whole new implication for that game's name, isn't there? And that's why they're still playing it 10,000 years later. So there you
Yeah.
go.
Oh, flipping heck, I love you. Right. The other thing I really loved, and I think it was totally unnecessary, I'm so glad you put it in, is that the space wolves live in a kind of like, interior mountain and they jump and they use like flying squirrels. They use egg
Yes.
to go, and I just thought that was so lovely. There was absolutely no need for that, but it really, I thought it was very charming. Um, but yay, I'm just going to check I've got no. Oh, yes. Ian asked a question.
Yeah.
And Ian thinks Sinch is behind it all. So he said, Dan, why couldn't have 1,000 Suns just been the bad guys? Teach behind it all is so confusing. So,
But it's meant to be. I think that this is a particularly knotty example of the fact that that's the story of the entire Horus Heresy.
yeah,
There is not a single person, even the most loyal of the loyals, like Rogel Dawn and everybody like that, they're still embroiled in the machinations of chaos. The Emperor certainly is, whether they want to be or not. So that there are these vast properties moving things around and changing things. And sometimes it gets incredibly tortuous. And that is the very nature of change, for example, in
Mhm.
this particular instance. You don't expect them to be anything other than that. So yeah, I do like the idea that with the books like this, we got an opportunity, or pairs of books like this indeed, get the opportunity, I say, not just to show you what the battle was like, but to lift the lid and go, and that's why it happened. Or rather, here is a fairly convincing argument for why it happened. Others may be available, sort of. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really enjoyed my trip to visit the Space Wolves. I
did
think,
you enjoy? I'm going to ask you a question actually now, because when you go to, like I said, there are a fairly large number of people who really don't like the novel because
yeah,
they didn't like the Space Wolves, and they felt that it spent far too much time not showing a straight battle report, which I think is a legit. It wasn't the novel they were expecting,
yeah.
and to them I apologize. But their rallying cry of the thing that represents the thing about the novel they don't like is the wet leopard growl, which is the trademark
Oh,
sort of back of the.
I highlighted, we had a few like, big cat growls.
Yeah.
I don't think I like Lehman Russ because he was, he's quite, yeah. Because
So I just imagined the idea that the with that particular thing, which I probably overused, although I don't think it did, because as far as I'm concerned, it becomes a phrase like said, where it becomes invisible. But wet leopard growl was meant to show the just quite how feral and predator they were. Almost they were like they are wolves.
yeah, I mean,
So it
I
is almost a base response, and I wanted to somehow capture that idea of that's the noise they made in the throat. So I deliberately used the same description for it all the way through the book, so you
yes,
knew that's what we were coming back to this thing. It's almost like saying the cat purrs, and then 10 pages later the cat purrs. It's like, well, of course you still use the word purr because he's still doing the same thing. But the people who do not like the book use that as an absolute
well, let me tell you.
the example of why the book is shit. Because what is he with this phrase? And I was like, okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. If that is a good example of why you don't like it, then that book wasn't for you.
Well, here's what I think. I mean, I'm not a fan of Lehman because he was so mean. He's just, what did Dad say to do? Okay, squash out civilization, no problem. All these pretty
Mhm.
pyramids gone, I will do it. I really liked it as um, a literary tactic. I suppose when I read books, I really notice stuff like that, and it gives me that kind of very, it's almost like poetic license to kind of, and I recognize that as a really beautiful thing that you've placed in there on purpose. And because Lehman Russ is in that short section of it, you get it more, but it kind of
Mm.
gives you the impression and the inflection around it. So I really enjoy those things because I know
Good.
as someone that has read a lot of your books and has to edit sometimes and has to write sometimes, I knew that there was a notion behind it, and I love literary conceits. I love intertextuality. Um, and yeah, I mean, I really, really hate, I read the first third through a love of you and trust in you because I knew it wouldn't be that gory. I hoped it wouldn't be that gory all the way through, but I think the payoff was, although it's an incredibly cold planet with very mercenary, thuggish, space marines, um, there was a character that just made me well up and cry, and it was so well realized, and it was part of this poor character, Hauser, abandoned at birth, scared of wolves, finds his love, is told he can't do that conservatory stuff anymore, takes himself off to the coldest planet, and is taken to the heart of the wolf pack. Sorry, I know this is Mira's vision of this is romanticizing it.
I
And
don't think at all.
there is it's the very elderly Longfang and
Mm.
the journey, and the shamanic kind of spiritual journey, and what happens when these big primarchs are, investigating somebody that's been planted within. But actually, it felt like quite a nurturing. Every action sequence, this human was at the center of protection the whole way through. I mean, he's
Hmm.
always nearly dying, but he's being saved by, they're not necessarily cuddly siblings.
No.
So that carried me through and it made me feel quite hopeful. And I did cry. I always cry reading your bloody books, but I, I, I did enjoy it, although I found it incredibly hard to get through. And rereading it again to talk to you, I liked it a lot more. And I think the last time we saw the Space Wolves, well, the first time I came across them was probably Battle of the Abyss.
Hmm.
Felt very, very different. So I think my Marmite would be too gory at the beginning and then, really loving how it unfurled at the end. I think
Good.
when Ian and I talk about it, I'm quite complaining about the gore, but
Well, no, I think that again, that's entirely legitimate. It is a
yeah,
particularly gory book, and
yeah,
but it is that characteristic of their feral nature because they are, like I said, they are wolves. It's each legion represents something that sort of an aspect or aspects of warfare, combat, or
yeah,
killing that they are particularly good at. And with each one, when you give the order to unleash a particular legion, that's you choose that legion because they're good at doing the thing you want them to do, and you expect them to do that. And many of them, not all, but many of them have breaks. So, for instance, if you
Mhm.
send the Ultramarines in and you say, right, that's far enough, you get this far and no further, they will do that because they have that obediency built into it. The thing that I think is amazing about the Space Wolves that I've always been fascinated by is the idea that they are like wolves or big cats or genuine predatory animals, is that you might just about convince them to fight for you, but once they are out there, that's it. A lion's not going to go, well, that's enough for today.
Yeah.
I've killed three gazelles. I won't kill the rest because Do you know what I mean? It's that idea that be careful what you're, and that's why they are the executioners,
Mm.
because it is not a, they are actually a very subtle weapon because they are stealthy as well as everything else, but they are a complete weapon, and they
Yeah.
are not a complete weapon that is sort of. You see, I told you that would happen. My phone would ring. I'm gonna.
Okay.
That's the Spaceballs ringing me up and say, stop telling them all our secrets. No, but I think that's it. The idea that the nastiness of the early part is really supposed to make you understand that they are very particular when it comes to what all Space Marine legions have a very particular flavor, and this is the very particular flavor of them, and it is really really difficult to even get close to, and it's so dangerous.
Well, I mean, I'm grateful that I get shone to the light. I think I had my first impression on reading, which is a very, very visceral, and I shouldn't even be in this universe. I should be reading, The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle again, probably for the 50th time. And I get so much from being able to talk to you and all the authors because the joy and the craft of these books, it just makes me fall in love with them even more. And I wish every reader got this because, I'm sure people love it immediately. And then I get to double read it and fall in love with all the extra additional stuff. And that's why thank you so much for letting me share it with all of our viewers because they
Well,
absolutely love
it's a absolute pleasure. I mean, that's why I suppose that after all these many centuries, I'm still doing it because
it. Yeah,
I still really enjoy engaging with the subject matter because there is so many different aspects to engage with,
yeah,
and I really enjoy the fact that there is this incredibly enthusiastic audience not specifically for my book, but for this universe. And if you try and tell, or you do a decent job of telling a good story in that, they really, really, really respond to it.
They
So I
do.
think that's, and you could, the sheer types of story. Like we said, this is a particularly up the front end, particularly gory, brutal story. It's
Yeah.
almost like sort of sword and sorcery glory. I mean, it's a sword and sorcery duo, isn't it? Because it's swords on one side and well axes, but you know what I mean. It's blades and sorcery. But then you could have other stories other novels that are just about one person or multi-stranded. There is so many different things you can do with it, and I
Yeah.
think that's a fascination to me. So I love the fact that not only do I get a reaction every time I put a book out and people come to me and they say, hopefully they'll say why they like it or they'll tell me why they didn't like it.
Yeah.
But the reactions, even if people who come to me and say, I liked your last book and I like this book as well, then it's for a different reason. It's not they didn't like it because they didn't like it for the same reasons because we're trying to do a different thing every time, and that is really really fun. It's like as I'm working on at the moment, the things that I can't tell you about, but I'm working on things going, what can I do this time that will be different to the things that I've done before? What can I surprise you with? I
But
think I've got a big surprise.
when you can tell me, you will tell me
Yeah,
immediately, I hope. And I mean, one day it is my dream in 2025 to maybe try and get you and Graham and maybe, in a chat together, even if we
that would
don't
be
share
fun.
with everybody. But I think I'm a better human for getting to spend time with you and all. Um,
Well, I'm sure I'm speaking for him, but I would love to do that. It'd be great fun to do that. And
yeah.
I can't tell you what I've been writing for the last few months, but I can tell you, obviously, because the last time we spoke, I was in the middle of a book which I couldn't tell you about, and now it's now out now because Interceptor City, which is what the book that I used to
Oh,
write my way out of the Siege of Terror, came out a couple of months. I think next month it comes out in the sort of standard hardback edition, and I'm really proud of that. And that is just a linear. There is not a single scene in that I think that doesn't have the main character in it. It's all about her all the way through. And so
okay.
it's a completely different structure of a novel, and I'm getting good feedback on that. And I think they're reissuing it, uh, or rather, they're putting it out with a reissue of Double Eagle, which was the
Wow.
first book in the series. Although you don't need to read them together, but you can now read them together. They're in matching editions, and that I'll mention it now. I wrote Double Eagle for the fun of writing it. I want to write an air combat novel, and that was probably 20 years ago. And it was a surprise success, and people really, really liked it. And I was delighted they liked it. So I said, I've got an idea for a sequel called Intercept City. And I never got to write it because the Horus Heresy got in the way. Every time I was like, I'm going to write Intercept City, there was the Horus Heresy. So the first thing I did when I finished the Horus Heresy was I wrote Intercept City, and it is the book that I would have written 20 years ago,
Wow.
except I made the decision to not because it's sort of vaguely related to the Gaunt's Ghost novel. So I didn't go back and set it 5 minutes later. It is set 20 years later. So the only thing that's changed in the course of writing it is the idea that I have allowed time to pass so
Wow.
that it is kept up with the continuity. And it was such a delight to write because it was so different to the other thing. So I hope the audience enjoys that because it's a very different thing. And
Yeah.
I hope that they'll enjoy the thing that I'm writing at the moment, which I am very close to finishing.
Will we see it on the telly with Henry Cavill in it, Dan?
Oh, if there's any justice in this world, we will.
Um,
And I say that not knowing anything about
anything.
anything.
None of us know anything. I don't.
Nobody knows a thing.
I went back into religion and pray for it every night, but that's fine. The emperor wouldn't mind on this occasion. So
No,
maybe
he wouldn't.
I'll see if I can read Double Eagle and Interceptor City and maybe talk to you about it. I don't
Oh,
know.
that I think that would be great because actually they're not massive books, and I
Yeah.
think if you read them together, you'd probably enjoy that, and we could talk about them as a whole because there's like I
Yes.
said, they can each be read individually. If you've never read Double Eagle, you can read Intercept City. I'm sure you'd really really enjoy it. But there are some nice callbacks, and of course, it's the same character. It's a character who originally appeared in Guns of Tanith, which is the
Okay.
fourth. It's the female fighter pilot from the Fantine
Fabulous.
world who gets her own series essentially. So she's now got two novels where she's fighting in the Sabbath Wells Crusade, but it's all the air combat stories about that and the stories.
I,
And there's sort of it gets very much more personal because it's distance combat. Obviously,
yeah.
they're flying, so it is a very different type of book. And coming back to that, the first one is the Double Eagle is more about the squadron of which she is the principal character, but the one 20 years later is all about her, and I really enjoyed writing it. I really enjoyed trying to make it feel really authentic. Like these planes were real things, and they worked in particular ways. And yeah, yeah, I had
Okay,
fun.
well, I'll get back into it. I did kind of peel off Gaunt's Ghost a little bit because I read the book where they all have to jump out of a plane, they all get flipping land on the roofs and break bits
Oh,
and
that is that one. That is the one where Jack Deere first appears.
that's the
Yeah,
last
yeah,
one
yeah.
I read. I was like, crikey. But when a mission starts, just never, if you're in Warhammer, never get in a drop ship and never agree to
No,
shoot
no.
out. Just but Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure. The last comment was from Raging Horn 7795, which is a bold username. And
It is a bold username.
Dan, do you have any Warhammer games going on at the moment? If not, you're invited to Gillingham to come and play 40k or Space Hulk with me anytime.
Well, that would be lovely. I have. That's the second invitation to Gillingham, which is just down the road from me, that I've had in a week, because there is I
Oh,
believe there is a big War Games event. I can't remember the date. It's close. It's the next month or so.
okay.
And knowing that I am local and knowing that I visit games and stuff like that, so I had an email from them saying, "Would you like to come along and have a sort of, just have a table and be here and
Yeah.
be amongst all?" Because it's not just 40k, it's general wargaming. And I'm still trying to work out whether I can do it, but if I can, I would love to do that. So I imagine that Raging Horn, who I'll now avoid carefully because of his name, will be at that if they're a Gillingham person and they like war games, and if not, then that's where they should go.
Oh,
So
that's
yeah.
lovely. So you are going to head there then. I think
I'm hoping to. Yes, I've got to confirm
okay.
it, but it's something I'd love to do. And if I do, then I will bring my Sharpie along, so that if people have things they want to get signed, I will sit at the table and ignore them. No,
Which
I will sign their books.
which reminds me that I have to get my Sabbat illustrated Sabbat World book back from Ian before the next time I
Yeah.
see you. So I'll do that too. Ian and I got invited to something called Beachhead next month, which I don't know if we'll do, but I am definitely going to Warhammer World in February at some point for my first time. So I'm excited.
Oh, that'll be an absolute treat.
I know. I'm going to eat and drink in the bar and everything. But
Mm.
Dan, as usual, adopt me. I love you so much. It's absolutely getting to talk to you. And I will
A
do a
pleasure.
stop of the recording here and say goodbye officially. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for all the lovely questions, and thank everybody else for all the lovely questions as well.
Yay. Bye. Okay.
Bye.
This book, it tells of a heresy tale, one of 60 you may have heard.